Wrong target. Mounting confusion in Libya as fighters accuse NATO of bombing the pro-democracy forces. The accusations coming just a day after the rebels' top military commander lashed out at the coalition, saying NATO is doing more harm than good. This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Taimur Nabili. Once again, Libya's pro-democracy fighters seem to be unable to hold the ground they've gained. They make headway for a few miles and then retreat as soon as they face pro-Gaddafi firepower. Meanwhile, the pro-Gaddafi forces seem to have adapted their efforts and are able to frustrate the NATO airstrikes. They no longer use tanks or other military vehicles that can be easily identified and attacked. Instead, they're using the same pickup trucks and civilian guise as the rebel fighters. So this situation on the ground is prompting NATO member states to consider what will be the next phase of this battle to oust Muammar Gaddafi. One of the options includes looking to the Arab countries to train the Libyan rebels, or at least to fund such training. Abdel Fattah Yunus, the head of Libya's opposition armed forces, meanwhile, has reiterated that NATO's acting too slowly or not acting at all.
I have reached a point where I'm fed up with NATO, and they are just a burden at the moment. They are with us, we have the coalition on our side, but they are doing nothing. The reaction is minor, but I expect what I've said yesterday in front of the world press will change their minds if they are willing to listen and understand.
Well, joining me now to discuss an increasingly confusing relationship between Libya's rebels and the coalition forces are, in London, the Libyan political commentator Juma Al-Gamati, also in London, Daniel Korski. He's a senior fellow at the think tank, the European Council on Foreign Relations, and joining us from Kuwait, Abdul Hadi Al-Ajmi, board secretary of the Kuwait Historical Society. Thank you very much indeed, gentlemen, all of you, for being with us. I want to just consider the issues that we have to address here, largely because everything seems at the moment so unfocused. Mr. Korski, let me begin with you first of all. What exactly is the prime problem that we're facing right now? The rebels are accusing NATO not only of being useless, but in some cases being positively detrimental to their cause, and yet they have no other help. So what exactly is the next step?
I mean, there are a number of problems here. Of course, first of all is the problem we already heard in your introductory package, which is that the rebels are not able to take advantage of some of the air support that they've been given in the last couple of days to defeat Gaddafi's forces in a number of crucial cities. And the second problem is the question of coordinating the ground offensive with air power. The NATO coalition, which is now taken over, is of course a much more bureaucratic beast than the nimble coalition that was quickly assembled by the Brits, the French and the Americans a couple of weeks ago. So it's going to be quite difficult to get this much larger organization that has 28 members, all of whom have to agree on every decision, to kind of deliver the kind of air power support that the rebels obviously want. And then there's a third problem, which is, well, what is the strategic endgame here? For how long is this going to go on? Will the coalition be happy to continue enforcing the UN Security Council resolution, even if the rebels are not able to strike decisively at Gaddafi's forces? And if it looks as if some of the humanitarian situation was to abate in future? These are some of the big questions that have to be debated now.
Juma Al-Gamati, is it acceptable for NATO to plead bureaucratic inefficiency in this context? Is it not rational for people to ask, well, why on earth was NATO put in charge of this in the first place? And how can they expect to achieve what they can if they don't seem to be able to agree amongst themselves?
Well, I think in 2011 it is unacceptable to say that NATO is suffering from bureaucracy. We may understand that there are some political motives behind some of the members blocking certain targets or certain attacks. We've heard a lot about Turkey maybe being very hesitant about approving certain attacks and certain targets, which would be very, very unfortunate, considering that Turkey is a Muslim country which has very strong historical ties with Libya and had very strong economic ties. We understand the economic interest of Turkey currently with the Gaddafi regime, but they should bear in mind that Libya post-Gaddafi will have even much larger opportunities for Turkey to benefit economically. So I don't think it's bureaucracy. It could be political factors. But whatever the reason is, the mandate is very clear. The Security Council resolution stipulates that all necessary measures should be taken to protect civilians, and yet civilians are still being targeted in Misrata and in the western region, in the western mountain, in Zintan, Kikla, Gila, and other places. And yesterday we saw that workers and oil fields have been targeted by Gaddafi's convoys, and the NATO took hours and hours and did not respond.
And the principal focus of our show today will be what the next step is likely to be, or can effectively be. But before we get to that, I just want to pick up that point that you made and put it to Abdul Hadi Al-Ajmi, because I've heard increasingly sentiments that were just expressed by Juma there being expressed elsewhere as well. The theory that NATO is not only perhaps having infighting to the extent that its own mission is being compromised, but conspiracy theories that, in fact, NATO doesn't really want to achieve very much at this particular time. Well, what do you make of all of this?
Actually, the whole region start not doubting, but cannot explain the lack of effectiveness in the NATO movement. Some talk about the United States somehow blown out from the whole movement, the whole support, and that could be an explanation. However, still, I think most people expected more dramatic change in al-Gaddafi capacity to move. However, al-Gaddafi proved to be, or at least his forces proved to be more organized, which is the natural case. However, the fall down of the Gaddafi system was very with a good speed before the NATO interfering, and after the NATO interfering, still the Gaddafi still hold right now, which is what pushed everyone to think again the capacity of the NATO and the whole mission to support the rebels. Again, the people doubt about the conspiracy theory. It's something strange right now. Everyone have looked to the Western movement in the region with conspiracy in a different way. However, this is the first time that the people in this region will doubt or think the lack of movement, the lack of military movement with this good speed. It's because conspiracy. And again, the region itself present us with a unique situation. It's the only time that we see people in the street supporting a Western military action against one of the Arab states or one of the Arab regimes. So this is an opportunity where the West or the NATO itself should work harder to gain or to use the people's support, the street support. There is no protest in any Arab city against the Americans or against the West for acting in such a way. Right now, everyone is protesting why they are not very effective in their
the people
action.
that are protesting are the rebels themselves. I mean, there may not be other people in other Arab nations protesting about this, but the people directly in the firing line do seem to have a problem with it. Let's migrate the conversation, though, into the next stage, and let's take it step by step, because before we can consider the option of maybe arming these rebels and training these rebels, we have to consider the option that maybe the current status quo is entirely acceptable. Mr. Korski, let me put that to you. I mean, the idea that a stalemate right now is enough to let Gaddafi run out his money, run out his arms, and come to the final conclusion on his own that he needs to negotiate his way out. Some people are suggesting this is perfectly acceptable. Do you think that's true?
Well, first of all, I think we have to ask acceptable to whom. When I visited eastern Libya just last week and I put this question to the various different rebel leaders, they were very clear that is completely unacceptable to them. They're not looking for a divided Libya. They're looking for a whole, free and democratic Libya, and it's very difficult for the international community
we can get there without necessarily upping the level of conflict within the country itself. We just allow the passage of time to persuade Gaddafi that his time is up.
But we're not upping the level of conflict. Colonel Gaddafi and his murderous henchmen are upping the level of conflict in the country. And the international community, through NATO, is simply trying to prevent civilian casualties while helping the rebels topple this terrible regime. So let's be absolutely clear about who's upping the level of violence here.
Right.
The question is really, if a stalemate is to happen, is it one that will ultimately favor Colonel Gaddafi or the rebels? I think it'll ultimately favor the rebels because Gaddafi will run out of money, run out of ammunition, and probably out of support.
Right.
But it probably won't happen in the next days or weeks, so it could be for a long time.
And that's the point, Juma Al-Gamati. Is that an acceptable strategy right now to wait some more weeks, maybe perhaps even months, until the stalemate persuades Gaddafi to step down? Is that acceptable?
No, absolutely not. And let me remind you also that Gaddafi, the way things are going, is not going to just wither away because the blockade and the sanctions are not watertight. I can assure you now, as we speak, we have information that Gaddafi is still getting mercenaries from Belarus, still getting mercenaries from some African countries. Weapons are still coming in. Fuel is coming in. He's just signed a contract with Total Turkey, an oil company in Turkey, Total Turkey, to supply 30,000 tons of fuel that's going to come in the next few days that will fuel his tanks and multi-rocket launchers. He's getting four-wheel drive cars through Tunisia today, and the people there are trying to blockade them. Algeria is still allowing fuel and mercenaries and other hardware to come through Algeria. So Gaddafi can keep up this because the blockade, the sanctions are not watertight. When we have Turkey with dithering, and we have Algeria implicitly siding with Gaddafi, when we have Belarus, when we have Chad, when we have other countries supplying mercenaries, there is something drastically wrong going on.
Abdul Hadi Al-Ajmi, you're saying that the regional governments are behind the movement in Libya and they're supporting the Western action, but Juma Al-Gamati there is suggesting that in fact many of them aren't and they're actually helping Gaddafi. Which is the actual case?
Actually, the whole Arab system right now, especially surrounding Libya, we have a vacuum in the countries. You know, Egypt position right now, there is no, they don't have a willing government that will be able to act in this regard. Tunisia, you have the case in Tunisia also, it's still not clear. Algeria, of course, will not support much of the rebels because Algeria does have its own scenario of maybe this case will be again seen later after a couple of months in Algeria. So the surrounding to Libya is hostile or not hostile, not in favor of the rebels themselves. Despite the people feelings supporting, of course, in Egypt there is clear support to the rebels in Libya.
Right.
However, in the whole region, we are facing a vacuum on the capacity. The GCC countries, the only one with a solid position in this regard, and it's not even that supportive. Still, they support the people. Qatar position is very important here, and I think it's very much with a great will to support this. UAE, Kuwait also, they showed different action. And I think those countries are capable of using their will in order to support this. The international community need a way out, a scenario that will help them to support the rebels. I think Qatar, UAE, Kuwait could be, or the GCC country could be the way to help the rebels in a way, in finding a solution to help them.
And one of these ways out that has been consistently mentioned, but nothing seems to have been done, is obviously the idea of directly arming the rebels. It's been debated for a while now, but most recently Britain once again dismissed that suggestion. Let's take a listen to what Britain has to say.
As I explained to the House last week, we are not engaged in arming the opposition forces. We are prepared to supply non-lethal equipment, which will help with the protection of civilian lives and the delivery of humanitarian aid. Given the urgent need of the Interim Transitional National Council for telecommunications equipment, the National Security Council has decided this morning to supply them with such equipment.
All right, well, that is the stated position of Britain's foreign minister. But Daniel Korski, isn't it reasonable and rational to assume that behind the scenes there is activity going on? Isn't it reasonable to assume that these private militias that have been so active over the past 10 years or so in the rest of the Middle East are operating inside Iraq, and they're getting help from people like William Hague and Washington, D.C.?
I think if the Foreign Secretary is saying to the House that the British government is not supplying lethal support to the rebels, that is the case. But it is probably also the case that a number of countries are trying to provide the kind of military advice the rebels so clearly need. A lot of the discussion recently has focused on arms or not arms. The real truth is that the rebel force remains a ragtag movement which consists of some people of considerable military capability and the rest are volunteers. And the real challenge over the next couple of weeks is going to not just to be training to train people, but to ensure that they have a rudimentary organization, that they can communicate with each other on the front, and they have a command and control system like all successful rebel movements must have if they want to win on the battlefield. And I think a lot of governments are probably supplying that kind of assistance at this moment. There's a sort of second question, which is, in addition, will the rebel movement need some kind of private sector assistance, some kind of support from the quote-unquote dogs of war, the mercenaries that have operated in Africa for the last 15 or more years? It may be the case. It's going to be controversial, of course. We have seen in some countries, Sierra Leone, Liberia and so on, where the involvement of mercenaries has been positive, in support of a democratically elected government against an undemocratic rebel force. But we've also seen examples of the opposite. And that's going to be a very controversial issue.
Juma Al-Gamati, the situation is a vexed one, isn't it? But the idea of arming the rebels is one that William Hague says Britain will not condone, but it will allow the idea that perhaps the Arab nations should be allowed to get involved in a much more active way. Does that make any more sense?
Indeed, it does. It makes a lot of sense. And by the way, I just want to qualify what I said earlier. I think Egypt and Tunisia on the whole are very sympathetic to the Libyan people, and they have been very supportive, especially on the popular side, but also on government side. And I think, you know, it will look much less controversial globally if some Arab and Muslim countries came to the aid of the Libyan people, even by arming, supplying arms, training. I'll tell you what, I'll go even as far as saying, as a Libyan, I would welcome Arab troops on Libyan soil to protect our cities and civilians. That will not be controversial at all, and the Libyan people would welcome that. I also, obviously, we salute the Gulf states' position politically, and they have been very solid and very supportive of the Libyan people. But countries like Kuwait indicated in the last couple of days that it will recognize the interim national council. I wish they could do that very quickly. Also, the UAE, who have been very supportive, they could do that. Morocco, for example, could recognizing the interim national council as the legitimate representative of the Libyan people will pave the way politically for many Arab countries who make that recognition to actually engage and give logistical support, training, arms, you know, a lot of support, and that will, you know, make it less controversial, and we will not need to go to countries like Britain or France or even America for that. I think this is an urgent need. If there is an agreement, if there is a consensus that Gaddafi and his sons are finished, they cannot be accepted, nobody will ever engage with them, they should not be allowed to crawl back to power in Libya again, and that the only way for them is to leave, then every effort should be done to support the Libyan people to bring about this conclusion sooner than later. It's just a matter of time, but the more effort, the more Arab support, the more Muslim support. Turkey's position is very unfortunate, but the more support from Arab and Muslim countries, the quicker this is brought to conclusion, the less bloodshed and the less misery for everybody, and the region can move towards a more stable situation for everybody.
Al-Ajmi, the question there was posed, why doesn't Kuwait actually come out more forcibly in favor of the transitional government? But the broader question behind that is also such that are we to understand that the Gulf nations are so united in this that they would perhaps take on Washington if there was a conflict of interest in this situation?
Yeah, actually, the GCC countries have clearly supported the Algerian people, the Libyan people in many different ways. However, still, Qatar initiative was the clearest among the GCC country. However, it seemed to be agreed upon in the GCC countries that supporting the Libyan people it's one of the step that's needed to help them. However, recognizing the national security was one of the requirement steps. Kuwait initiative was very important because it's the second country in the region that talk about it. However, it's needed time. Some internal issues like the last government have left the office and the new government in place. This is taking time. However, it's obvious that Kuwait declaration in itself was a recognition that Libya is there is a new stage, and there is no way to recognize Gaddafi nor his sons as representatives of the Libyan people. What is very important also for us in this region, in the GCC country, that we're thinking that a very important issue most of people not thinking about is dividing Libya to two sides, one the rebels and one Gaddafi and his group. However, we think that it's the whole Libya, half of Libya is under right now torturing. The rebels, at least they have some freedom. However, people who's under the control of Gaddafi regime, they are being tortured, they are being forced to cheers for a dictator who's killing his citizens. So I think a serious support. And one final point in this regard, I would like to speak also about Qatar movement in the whole support in the oil process of the Libyan oil company. I think that is what we need. We need a GCC country help to the Libyan people to be able to create a state that organized not only the military but the whole system, and that can be done in Benghazi, trying to create a system to help the Libyan government, the new Libyan government, in order to recognize, to reorganize itself in the military level and as a state.
Juma Al-Gamati, I just want to put the same question to you about the composition of any kind of a Gulf force and the motives of the Gulf Cooperation Council at the moment, because you clearly expressed a preference that the Arab nations should take the lead in helping the Libyan people, whether it be with further military training or arming or otherwise. But to what extent are you confident that the GCC is united enough, has a strong enough and regular enough leadership that it's making decisions on behalf of its own people, as opposed to having much more of a Western influenced agenda?
No, I think the GCC have been motivated by an Arab agenda. They were very resolute, very strong from the beginning. They came out in the support of the Libyan people. They could not accept this manslaughter, this madness that Gaddafi has been engaged in over the last 6 weeks, and rightly so. So I think the motives are clear, they are sincere, and we appreciate all of that. All I'm saying is that we thank you very much for what you have done so far, but please, we need more. I mean, you know, Arab forces coming in to guard the cities, for example, to guard the civilians, then that will allow the Libyan revolution fighters to be more engaged with chasing these Gaddafi security battalions and try to reduce their capacity and wither them down.
We're almost out of time, but gentlemen, let me ask Daniel Korski finally then, if we want more, if we're going to authorize more, what exactly does that mean in terms of NATO's and the UN 1973 resolution? How much more are they able to give, do you think?
Well, first of all, I think it's very important that we move away from these old, staid distinctions between what are in the interest of the West and what are in the interest of the Arab people. There is clear a unified interest across a much broader spectrum of nations in the Middle East and in the West in helping the Libyan people free themselves of the kind of oppression that Gaddafi has represented. I think that's very important to acknowledge now. That said, there are, of course, fissures both inside NATO and some distinctions and disagreements across the alliance. And I think, for example, Egypt, though people are sympathetic in Egypt to the plight of the Libyans, the government itself is struggling with a number of transition issues itself. So I don't think we're going to expect a lot of support.
But very quickly, if we are going to talk about arming the rebels, whether it be by the West or by the Gulf, by the GCC nations, is there a need for a new UN mandate? Is the existing structure able to accommodate that?
I don't think there's an interest in a new mandate. I think it's going to be very difficult to get a Security Council resolution through. The fact that the Chinese and the Russians were willing to acquiesce to this resolution doesn't mean that they're willing to do so again in future. So I think that there's going to be a desire to keep the resolution as it is, to continue to beaver away with the NATO mission, of course adjusting it so that it can be more effective than it has been in the last couple of days, but then bilaterally on the side try to assist the rebel forces in ways in which allow them to resist the kind of offensive that Colonel Gaddafi is still continuing against his own people.
And that is where we're going to have to leave it, gentlemen. Thank you very much indeed to all of you. That was Daniel Korski joining us from London. We were also joined from London by Juma Al-Gamati, and in Kuwait, Abdul Hadi Al-Ajmi. Thank you all for speaking on Inside Story today, and thank you so much for joining us on this edition of the programme. We always welcome your comments and suggestions. Email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. But for the moment, it's goodbye.